Hello and welcome, everybody. And I have to say, y'all seem pretty confused. I ran the following polls on YouTube and on Twitter. And on the left, you see the YouTube poll where it seems that the majority of people within the last 8 days seem to believe that Slayer's Stronghold, Sunhome, and Boros Garrison is the best way to kill your opponent with 2 amulets in the deck Amulet Titan. Whereas on the right, it seems that the people on Twitter are more convinced about Hanweir, Mirapool, and Oranreef. And if these are cards that you're not familiar with, then stick with me because this is going to be a very interesting deep dive into a niche part of the Annual Titan community. And today we seek to answer the question, which of these land packages is better? What are the advantages and disadvantages to playing these cards, and which should you be playing in Annual Titan today? And so, just to give you an overview of what we'll be covering today, we will look at the lands that are being discussed here, what packages, as I like to say, are usually played. We're going to look at the card Hanweir battlements and discuss why it suddenly seemed to become playable. We're going to look at different lines using both types of packages involving as many as 2 amulets and as few as having 0 amulets in play, including several Hanweir lines that are kind of newer with the newer cards that are added to the deck that you may not be familiar with. In fact, many of them in researching this video I was not familiar with, and now I can deliver that knowledge to you. We're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages with the goal that you can make the best informed decision. I will tell you my personal recommendation, but at the end of the day, this is to provide you with the information that you need to know in order to make the decision on your own. But I will give my recommendation at the end, and at the very end, if you want to go further down the rabbit hole, I'll mention something else that you may not be aware of that's kind of underground right now, and will jump scare you at the end. So, moving straight into the beef of this, what are we talking about? Who are the contenders here? And the first one is going to be the familiar grouping of 4 that you probably already know and love if you're familiar with Amulet. That is the land Slayer's Stronghold, giving +2/+0 and Vigilance and Haste until end of turn for the measly cost of a red and a white mana. Sunhome, which gives double strike for 4 mana. Boros Garrison, the red and white land that we're going to be using to enable these. And Vesuva, a land that allows you to copy something in play, as we will see this will be very important in the discussion upcoming. And this is compared to the relatively newer card, Hanweir Battlements. It's just a single red in order to give a creature haste until end of turn, and that's pretty much the only thing you need to know about it. And up until recently, this card was not really particularly notable in Amulet Titan until the following package was discovered: Litjara Mirror Lake, which allows you to copy a Titan, and Kessig Wolfrun, which allows you to pump up one of your Titans to a very large amount and be able to kill your opponent. This combination of 2 lands allowed the Hanweir Battlements lists to kill off of 2 Amulet of Vigors and a single Primeval Titan in a similar fashion to the way that Boros Garrison and Slayer's Stronghold and Sunhome allow. But in recent times, these lands have been subbed out for what you could argue are better versions of them. Mirapool, allowing you to copy an instant or sorcery, allowing you to copy at instant speed during your opponent's turn, things along those lines, and Oranreef, allowing you to put permanent +1/+1 counters on your creatures, which we'll get into more detail later. But this pairing of 3 also allows you to kill your opponent with 2 Amulet of Vigors, as we will see. So, let's talk about those lines now. Firstly, if you have 2 amulets in play and you just resolve a Primeval Titan, you can follow the following line. You can search for Boros Garrison and Slayer's Stronghold. You can activate Slayer's Stronghold twice, since you get 2 untaps with the 2 amulets, and then return the Slayers to your hand. And then, at this point, you'll have a +4/+0 Primeval Titan, totaling as a 10/6, and you can attack with it. So, you attack with your Titan, you search for Sunhome and Vesuva, and then you use Vesuva to copy Boros Garrison, and you'll get 2 untapped, so Boros Garrison will float 4 mana and allow you to activate Sunhome to double strike your Titan, resulting, of course, in a 10/6 Titan with double strike, which is exactly 20 damage to kill your opponent, just by resolving Primeval Titan with 2 amulets in play. It's important to note here that because Vesuva is one of the lands you have to search for from your deck with Primeval Titan, all 4 of these lands must be in your deck in order to kill your opponent. If you happen to have naturally drawn Slayer's Stronghold, say for example that it's in play tapped because you just use it to cast your Primeval Titan, you can't rely on being able to search for Vesuva and copy your Slayer's Stronghold, because then when you attack and you're supposed to get Sunhome and Vesuva to copy the Boros Garrison, your Vesuva is already in play copying Slayers, so there's not much you can do about that. And so in that sense, Vesuva is one of the key lands in this line. And in direct comparison to the Hanweir package, we'll notice that becomes very important. So, speaking of that Hanweir package, how is it that you kill your opponent with 2 amulets and Hanweir in your deck instead of the Slayer's Boros Garrison setup? Well, of course, you're resolving Titan with 2 amulets in play. First, you search for that Mirapool we talked about earlier, which lets you copy your Primeval Titan in play. which of course you do, and now you have 2 Titans. The second Titan will search for Valakut and Hanweir, allowing you to haste both Titans. Again, you're getting 2 untaps with each, 1 untap with each amulet, so 2 untaps total. And at this point, you'll have 2 Primeval Titans that can both attack, so you're going to go ahead and do that. And your first Titan will be able to search for 2 bounce lands and float 8 mana in total. And then the second Titan attack trigger lets you get Castle Wolfrun and Gruul Turf, which initially, with the first untap, you'll just float 3. But then the second untap, you can activate the Castle Wolfrun for a total of plus 11 plus 0 on one of your Titans. And this totals to 23 damage. However, with the update of adding Oran Reef to the deck, there's a improved, so you could say, kill, which involves attacking with those 2 Titans, searching initially for 2 Mycosynth Gardens, which you will then use to copy the Amulet of Vigor that you have in play, the 2 amulets. So now you'll have a total of 4 Amulet of Vigors in play. And then the second Titan attack trigger will search for Oran Reef and any other land. And of course, with 4 amulets, you'll be untapping Oran Reef and tapping it 4 times for a total of exactly 20 damage. So just like the Slayer Stronghold and Boros Garrison line, the new Hanweir line allows you to get exactly 20 damage out of your Primeval Titan. So if you happen to have Primeval Titan 2 amulets on the board and the relevant lands in deck, you can just kill your opponent, assuming they have no blockers, which, of course, is an imperative thing in comparing the 2 lines, because if you, for example, couldn't kill your opponent with the Hanweir line, but you could with Boros Garrison, Slayer Stronghold, Sunhome, in theory, we wouldn't be talking about this. But of course, these lines discovered for Hanweir allow for this discussion to be had in the first place. And again, I want to reiterate that with the Hanweir line, at no point are you required to search for Vesuva. In the Slayer Stronghold line, Vesuva is required to copy Boros Garrison. However, in the Hanweir line, you can search up Vesuva if you have your Hanweir battlements tapped and in play. You can just search for Vesuva and Valakut and still be able to haste. So, in this way, if you've drawn one of the 3 important lands, being the Hanweir, the Oran Reef, or the Mirror Pool, you can simply copy that land with Vesuva and still be fine. So if you happen to have gotten unlucky and drawn one of those lands, Vesuva will bail you out, whereas in the Slayer Stronghold line, that is not the case. In addition, however, there's one unique thing about playing Hanweir in these double amulet scenarios, and that's if you happen to already have Hanweir in your hand and you're resolving Titan with 2 amulets in play, you actually have a line that allows you to put the Hanweir in play. So first you're going to search for Mirror Pool and copy your Titan like you normally would, and then you'll have your Titan copy, which will allow you to search for Talari West and Gruul Turf. And again, you're untapping each twice with the 2 amulets you have in play, so you'll be floating a total of 6 mana and then returning the Talari West to your hand. You can use 2 blue and a green to transmute the Talari West for Summoner's Pact and Pact for Arboreal Grazer, and then you use the green to play Arboreal Grazer, put Hanweir into play tapped, and with your 2 remaining red floating, you can activate Hanweir on both Titans. So if you happen to have the Hanweir in your hand, and you're playing the Hanweir build as opposed to Slayer Stronghold, all you have to do is transmute for Pact, Pact for Grazer, Grazer in the Hanweir, and now you get to haste your Titans no problem. So this is a second scenario where if you happen to have gotten unlucky, either you have a Hanweir or something else in play, you can Vesuva it. If you happen to have the Hanweir in your hand, you can just search for Talari West and Gruul Turf and still be able to haste both your Titans. So this, again, is another easy fix for a potentially common problem that you can't really address with Slayer Stronghold. However, it is important to talk about situations other than just relying on having 2 amulets in play, because this is not always the case. So looking at some single amulet scenarios, let's take a look first of all at Slayer Stronghold, because Slayers allows you to do some very important things. For example, you're resolving a Primeval Titan with 1 amulet in play. You can search for Boros Garrison and Slayer Stronghold, and if you have a land drop remaining, you can just return the Boros Garrison to your hand and then play it for turn using your 1 land drop. And then when you attack with your Titan, you can search for a bounce land in Sunhome and still be able to double strike your Titan. So that means that with 1 amulet in play and an extra land drop floating, you can get up to 16 damage. And sometimes if your opponent's fetch shocked or, fetched and then fetch shocked, they could be at 16 and you could kill them like that. And that's one thing that's unique to the Slayer's package, is that on just a single amulet, your Titan is capable of doing up to 16 damage, which is not the case for Hanweir. However, there are some important Hanweir lines that involve only 1 amulet that are also relevant to consider. So if you have Hanweir in your deck and you resolve a Titan with 1 amulet in play, you can search for Crumbling Vestige on Hanweir and float a red with the ability of the Vestige and then untap it with the amulet, and then use the red and the Hanweir to haste your Titan and still have Crumbling Vestige untapped. And then when you attack with your Primeval Titan, you can search for a bounce land and Otawara, and being able to tap all 4 for a total of 4 mana, you can pick up the Otawara and return something from your opponent's side of the battlefield to their hand. So one thing that commonly comes up in discussions about these 2 lines is that the Slayers allows you to give your Titan Vigilance and so when you attack with it, you can still block with it. Whereas Hanweir makes you tap your Primeval Titan when you attack with it. However, this line sort of shores up for that weakness by allowing you to bounce one of your opponent's creatures. So assuming that creature doesn't have haste, they're not going to be able to attack with that creature during their next turn. So it's almost like your Titan blocked their creature. But on top of that, it also means that they can't block your Primeval Titan. Say, for example, if they have a really big Murktide Regent, you can bounce the Murktide Regent and still be able to attack into that board, while also making it so that not only is their Murktide not going to attack you on the way back during the next turn, giving you a pseudo-vigilance on your Primeval Titan, it also means they have to reset their Murktide. They may not even be able to replay it again. So this is one advantage of playing the Hanweir line that lets you shore up for the fact that you don't have vigilance, because one time you can use this Otawara line to effectively save yourself the trouble of taking the damage from one of the creatures. So it's like a pseudo-vigilance, so to speak. However, if you happen to be playing Urza's Cave, you could also use a similar line, and instead of getting Simic Growth Chamber Otawara, you can search for Simic Growth Chamber in Urza's Cave, and that will give you the 3 mana available plus the Urza's Cave to tap and sacrifice the cave during your opponent's turn and search for a land instant speed. So you could get Bajuka Bog to exile your opponent's graveyard at instant speed, and any other land you can think of that has good instant speed usage. For example, maybe searching for a Valakut at instant speed to get a damage trigger, or a fetch land to get 2 if you already have a Valakut in play, or I don't know, like a Sajiri Step or something that gives your Titan protection from a color. Various things that in the future could improve the card Urza's Cave in Amulet Titan. This line is available to only the Hanweir build because you can haste off of the Crumbling Vestige and leave it in play, whereas you can never do this with Boros Garrison because you have to use both white and red mana to haste your Titan, whereas with Crumbling Vestige and Hanweir, you get to leave the Crumbling untapped, and so that gives you access to these tech One-amulet lines. And I want to do a special shout out here to Nate 4EV from the Amulet Discord for helping me to learn these lines. These were ones that I was not familiar with, but now I know. And one other super interesting line with a new card, Springheart Nantuko, allows you to get an infinite Splinter Twin, so to speak, kill out of your Primeval Titan if you have only one single amulet. And again, it's going to start very familiarly. First, you search for Crumbling Vestige and Hanweir Battlements, and you're floating your red here from the Crumbling Vestige. Then you haste, leaving the Vestige untapped, and you attack. And at this point, if you play a fetch land in your deck, then you can search for Simic Growth Chamber and Misty Rainforest, pick up some other land that's not any of these 3 in play, and in your second main phase, you can just bestow your Springheart Nantuko on the Titan, allowing you to pay 2 whenever land comes into play to make a copy of your Titan. And then, of course, you fetch, getting a basic forest or whatever forest you can have that'll untap with Amulet Vigor, and you have exactly 2 mana to start the Titan combo, and then your Titan copy will let you get 2 lands to copy Titan, to make another Titan, to get 2 more lands, so on and so forth. Even from this point, you could start copying your Amulet Vigors with Mycosynth Gardens, for example, and start netting mana, and eventually get Talaria West, bounce it to your hand, transmute for Summoner's Pact for Dryad, and play Dryad, and then start going off with Valakut by continuing to make Titan copies. So this is one avenue to getting infinite Primeval Titans in your second main phase, and also just straight up killing your opponent once you have enough mana and enough amulets in play that you have access to uniquely with the Hanweir Crumbling Vestige lines that are not in any way available to the Slayer Stronghold lines. So this is yet another unusual thing that I did not previously know until researching for this video that you can do specifically with the Hanweir build and having a Nantuko and fetch land in your deck. So if you see lists playing Nantuko and a fetch land, then now you know why that's being done. So on top of that, it's important to discuss how these lands interact with having no amulets in play, because sometimes your opponent interacts, sometimes you just don't draw the amulet, and there's a clear winner on which land is better when it comes to playing without an amulet in play, and that land is Hanweir. Because if you, for example, resolve a Primeval Titan, you still have 1 land to play for turn, but you have Hanweir in play, you can search for Crumbling Vestige and Simic Growth Chamber, float a red with a Vestige, and then pick up your Hanweir Battlements to the bounce land trigger, and then use your land drop for turn to play the Hanweir and be able to haste your Primeval Titan. Similarly, if you have a red floating when you play your Titan, you can resolve Titan with your red floating, search for Hanweir in a bounce land, and this time you pick up the Hanweir Battlements, and then you play the Hanweir for turn, and you're able to haste your Primeval Titan off the red floating. Again, these are things that you can easily do with Hanweir, but you don't have access to at all without Slayer Stronghold. So Titan is much more easy to haste with 0 amulets in play if you're playing the Hanweir build, but this is not the case for Slayer Stronghold. So now that we've talked about some of the most important lines involving both packages of lands, let's talk about some advantages and disadvantages. So first of all, with Hanweir, one of the advantages is you don't have to play Boros Garrison, the red-white bounce land, And that's obviously great because the more green bounce lands you can play, the easier it is to cast Titan. Boros Garrison has always been the worst bounce land in Amulet, and you don't have to play it with Hanweir, and that is an advantage. On top of that, when you need to kill your opponent, you can use Vesuva to patch up a hole that, could be caused by Oran Reef being in play, Hanweir being in play, whatever. You can rely on Vesuva to dig you out of that hole, whereas with the Slayer Stronghold build, you would have to be playing a second Vesuva or just not be able to do that. So that's an advantage of the Hanweir line. Having Mirror Pool in your deck also allows you to copy a Primeval Titan during your opponent's turn for instant speed Valakut triggers if you need to interact with their board, or if they played a One Ring or some other thing that allows them to have protection. You can't target them with Valakut that turn. You can go to their upkeep, copy your Titan, and kill them in their upkeep. And that's something that you can do with the Hanweir lines that involve Mirror Pool that you wouldn't usually see in a Slayer Stronghold build. We already talked about how it's easier to haste a Titan without Amulet in play. We also already talked about how you can search for Gruul Turf and Tolaria West, pack for Grazer, and put in Hanweir from hand if you happen to have your Hanweir in hand. That's something that you can't do in the Slayer's builds. It just naturally works well to play the Hanweir build with Dryad and Valakut, because every time you go to haste your Titan, it's pretty much always Valakut Hanweir, and then in the future, if for some reason your Titan gets killed or whatever, it doesn't work out, now you have a Valakut in play that naturally makes just drawing Dryad or playing Dryad out much better, because you already have Valakut in play. We discussed the Infinite Nantuko line, where if you just have one Amulet in play, you can second main phase kill your opponent by making infinite Titans. We talked about the pseudo vigilance with Otawara and having access to Urza's Cave if that's something you choose to play. One thing we didn't touch on is that with the Hanweir list, you don't effectively have to play any copies of Gruul Turf. You can if you want to splash red, or if you want to be able to very easily haste your Titan off of a single red floating. But if you really want to splash, for example, white or black for sideboard cards, all you have to do is cut the 4 Gruul Turfs, play 4 of the other land, and you already have some amount of fixing for a splash color, whereas with the Boros Garrison build, not only are you required to play Boros Garrison, but you also probably need to play a Selesnya Sanctuary and a Gruul Turf just to make sure that your combo lines are intact if you happen to draw some awkward lands. And then some advantages specific to playing either Oran Reef or Kessig Wolfrun. Oran Reef allows you to give permanent +1/+1 counters with no mana investment, just the Oran Reef being tapped itself, and those +1/+1 counters are lasting, so during the rest of the game, you're going to have a 1/4 or bigger Grazer, or a Dryad that allows you to block a 4-power creature, or, that attacks for 3. Various things like this, being able to put +1/+1 counters on Saplings if you happen to play a copy of Colony Garden. On top of that, you can use Oran Reef, if it's untapped in play, to play around 6 damage removals, like Asmore activating to have a creature deal 6 damage to yourself. You can respond to that by tapping Oran Reef and making your Titan a 7 toughness creature so it doesn't die to that. Similarly with Unholy Heat, or if your opponent could have double bolt to kill your Titan. If you have Oran Reef untapped and in play, those things will not work, because you just tap the Oran Reef, put the counter on your Titan, and then your Titan survives 6 damage removal effects, which is uniquely relevant in current Modern. It's also the fact that Oran Reef taps for green, so if you play it on turn 1, you can play a turn 2 Grazer. It taps for a turn 2 Explore. It allows you to tap it to cast a Titan if you're a little low on green mana, so that is an advantage. It also interrupts Yawgmoth's Undying with Young Wolf and Strangleroot Geist, so allows you a little bit of play against Yawgmoth, just for a very flexible, tiny advantage. It also allows you to kill your opponent with the Grazer and Nantuko combo if you use your last put land into play trigger to put in Oran Reef and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on all of your Grazers. Then the turn after, you can attack with all of them, and they'll all be 1-power creatures. So it makes your twin combo literally lethal the turn after if your opponent doesn't wipe the board. And of course, when you search for Oran Reef, you also get 1 additional land. We didn't talk about this, but you can use Vesuva to copy Oran Reef if you have Vesuva in deck to do a little extra damage, and also allow you to get like a bounce land and pick some stuff up. So like, you search for like Oran Reef and an Otawara, and then you attack and get Hun. So your first Titan gets Oran Reef Otawara, and then you search with your second Titan for Vesuva copying Oran Reef and a bounce land, and all of a sudden you have access to Otawara to bounce. That's something else you can do. So Oran Reef allows your land choices to be very flexible when you're doing one of your double amulet combo turns. Whereas with Kessig, you can turn any creature into a threat by sinking a ton of mana into the Kessig Wolfrun. It can be a little awkward at times, because it basically uses up your whole turn if you're doing that, but it is something you have access to, especially if your Titans get extracted. You can potentially use Kessig to kill your opponent. However, there are some disadvantages to playing Hanweir, and one of those disadvantages, the most notable by most people who will be having this discussion, is that Hanweir doesn't grant vigilance, so you can't block with your Titan. But of course, in a one-time usage, you can use the Otawara to bounce your opponent's creature if really that is necessary, and you'll have a one-time pseudo-vigilance. but it is still a disadvantage. On top of that, if you try to mirror pool to copy your Titan to go for one of these double amulet kills that we talked about, and your opponent happens to terminate your Titan or solitude it or just use some removal spell to kill your Titan, you lose your mirror pool indefinitely, and you will no longer be able to try to execute that kill in the future, which is obviously not fantastic. Whereas if you try to do that with Slayers and Boros Garrison, you'll still have the Slayers and Boros Garrison in play, and it'll be fine, and it'll be fine in the future. On top of that, you have to play a mirror pool, which usually, in my experience, replaces the second copy of Tolaria West that the Boros Garrison builds would usually play. Sometimes they'll play a mirror pool anyways, but if you're a person who enjoys playing Tolaria West, then you'll probably have to cut one to make room for the mirror pool, because it makes the most sense. And then if you only have one amulet in play, and you don't have access to Nantuko in deck for some reason, if you're not playing it, or if you have it, I don't know, discarded or something, then the best you're going to be able to do is 6 damage from an attacking Titan, plus maybe a little bit of interaction. If you have Dryad, you can search for a bunch of Valkuts, and that'll be great. But otherwise, you're not really able to do much with the Hanweir on one amulet. Some specific disadvantages to the individual lands you can play in the Hanweir package are that Oran Reef enters tapped, and if you're trying to kill your opponent with Kessig Wolfrun, this will require you to search for tons and tons of bounce lands to try to kill your opponent, and you don't have much freedom with that. So that's generally why Oran Reef sees more play than Kessig, in addition to the million different reasons Oran Reef is good on its own compared to Kessig that we discussed before. So some advantages and disadvantages of playing the Slayer Stronghold package. First of all, you get Vigilance, which is an advantage. You always have Vigilance every turn that you want to activate Slayers, as opposed to the one-time pseudo-Vigilance with Otawara, and that can be very useful. On top of that, we already discussed this, but if your opponent just kills your Primeval Titan when you try to double haste it with the Slayer Stronghold, you'll still have Slayers and the Boros Garrison in play, and Sunhome will still be in your deck. You can use those later if you want to, whereas with Mirror Pool, if you try to copy your Titan to go for the kill, you get blown out. So it's obviously better in those situations to not have to use up your Mirror Pool. And like I said, if you want to, you can play a second copy of Tolaria West instead of that Mirror Pool. So if you want more access to being able to transmute for a Summoner's Pact, or transmute for engineered explosives, or a pact of negation or something like that, you get those advantages. You do have the advantage of sometimes occasionally being able to produce 16 damage, and the single amulet lines, we talked about having additional land drop floating, so if you want to review that, then feel free to go back and look at that. And then just a couple of kind of anecdotal advantages. In theory, getting +2/+0 to your creature, like being able to attack with a Grazer for 2, is relevant. Sometimes it's good against Planeswalkers. It's kind of anecdotal. It doesn't, who knows how good that really is. And then on top of that, you can give Double Strike with Sunhome if you happen to have the Sunhome in play. In my personal experience, that almost never matters. I find Sunhome to be extremely irrelevant most of the time, but in theory, it's an advantage. And then the disadvantages of Slayers, which are slightly more numerous than the disadvantages of Hanweir, but it certainly has much fewer advantages. The disadvantages include having to play Boros Garrison, which if you ever draw Boros Garrison, you'll know exactly why that is not ideal. You also need Vesuva to be in your deck in order to kill your opponent with 2 amulets and resolving a Titan, whereas if you were in the same situation in the Hanweir build, you could Vesuva something in play, and that does come up quite frequently. It also has either no synergy or dis-synergy, meaning working against playing with Dryad and Valakut, because with Hanweir, you can search for Valakut when you go to haste your Titan, and it's all great, perfect synergy, whereas with Boros Garrison and Slayer Stronghold, at best, you can't use Valakut to haste your Titan, so you'll have to play multiple copies of Valakut, whereas in theory you could maybe just play one in the Hanweir builds. But at worst, you're returning a land to your hand with the Boros Garrison and then not being able to get Valakut triggers because you don't have enough lands in play down the line, and sometimes that does happen. You also don't have access to the, One-amulet Nantuko Infinite line. You don't get those Otawara bounces or Urza's Cave lines that we talked about with Hanweir. Those are not possible with Slayers. It's also not possible generally to haste your Primeval Titan without an amulet in play, just because Hanweir, all it requires is 1 extra red source, so you could just have a Gruul Turf, for example, and be able to haste, whereas with the Slayer's lines, you typically have to already have Boros Garrison in play, or a Dryad to make white and red in order to haste your Titan, and it's just really difficult. It doesn't really come up a lot. On top of that, your utility lands are worse than the Hanweir build. In Hanweir, you have Oran Reef, which lets you play around removal and does all the things we talked about before. You get Mirror Pool, which lets you be able to copy your Primeval Titan during your opponent's turn and get Valakut triggers through One Ring, all kinds of stuff. Whereas with Slayers and Sunhome, you get exactly what they say they do: +2/+0, Double Strike. That's it. Whereas there's some interesting tech things you can do with Oran Reef and Mirror Pool that you can't really do with the Slayers lines. So I would say that the Oran Mirror Pool package is more versatile if you just naturally draw the lands compared to Slayers and Sunhome. You may disagree. And then on top of that, the Slayers requires you to play some lands that tap for white, including Boros Garrison and probably at least one copy of Selesnya Sanctuary, so you can activate Sunhome if you happen to have drawn the Garrison or Vesuva. It does happen. So you already are restricted in requiring to play some white lands, so pretty much you can only splash white, whereas with the Hanweir build, you can easily just play 4 Golgari Rot Farms or 4 Selesnya Sanctuaries or whatever it is you want to play and be able to splash a color. It's not as easy to do in Slayer's build. So having said all of this, what is it that I recommend? What do I think is best? I'm not going to tell you what I think you should play, but I will tell you what I would play, and that is the Hanweir Oran-Reef Mirror Pool package. And I think it's not particularly close, personally. The biggest things to me are being able to haste your Titan without an amulet in play, being able to search for Vesuva in your combo turns if you have a land in play, all these cool single amulet lines, the Nantuko Infinite, Otawara, Urza's Cave stuff, that's pretty cool. Urza's Cave isn't really played much, but if there were access to more cool instant speed land effects, Urza's Cave could be good in the future, especially if you need access to instant speed Bog. Like, imagine being able to instant speed Bog your opponent playing Hogak back when Hogak was a super big menace in the format. That would have been something super cool to have access to at the time, and I'm sure it can come up in the future. You also get Mirror Pool for those instant speed Valakut triggers, Oran-Reef for playing around 6 damage removal, which I think is super cool. Never having to draw Boros Garrison, that absolutely was the worst land in the deck, and you never have to do that again if you're not playing Boros Garrison, so that's a huge plus for me. And being able to just always set up Dryad and Valakut in the future when you plan to haste your Titan, because even if everything goes south, you'll still have a Valakut in play to be able to start getting Dryad triggers down the line. So those are the things that really tilt it in favor of Hanweir and Oran-Reef and Mirror Pool for me. But there's also all of the advantages that we talked about and some of the disadvantages. I think the advantages way outweigh the disadvantages of Hanweir, and on top of that, I think that there are far fewer advantages to Boros Garrison's, package, and way more disadvantages. So to me, I think it's clearly this package that wins, but let me know what you think in the comments below. And with that, I would like to remind you to subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and that's it. That's the end. That's it. Wait, no, what is this? No, I don't want to have to think about this.